Matthew Barzun. Welcome to the new school at Commonweal.
Michael, thanks for having me.
Matthew, it is such a deep joy to have this conversation with you. We'll be talking about your new book, The Power of Giving Away Power, which the subtitle, How the Best Leaders Learn to Let Go. But we'll also be talking about your life and in conversation, real conversation, because I find your book so important to me personally. I read all the time. I imagine you read all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know what I must read or half read a couple of hundred books a year. So that's what I do. I read. And so I know books. This is an extraordinary book.
Oh, Michael, I cannot tell you how good that feels coming from you.
No, it's an extraordinary book. I am literally going to be giving copies to a whole set of my friends and colleagues because I want them to understand from within what is to me an exposition of my whole philosophy of collaborative leadership. What my friend and colleague Oren Schlossberg, who's my successor at Commonweal as executive director, but he calls it intergenerational leadership in our case. Because he didn't want to succeed me. He wanted to work with me and have all of us participate. And it's our whole model of work at Commonweal that I will get into. But your book created a framework for me to reflect on how we work, how we've worked for 45 years, and what we've learned about that. So I'm just thrilled.
Oh, well, that makes two of us.
Yeah.
And hopefully more.
And also, to say it, your grandmother, Eleanor Winthrop, was a friend of my mother's and a friend of mine. We worked together on mind-body health issues. Your mother, Sarita Winthrop, is a wonderful friend of mine. Your grandfather, Jacques Barzun, is one of the most extraordinary public intellectuals of our time with his extraordinary studies at Columbia of cultural and intellectual history. So as someone who loves these kinds of personal connections, I've just been so looking forward to that. So enough.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you.
So let's turn to the book. You write in the book that a colleague of yours said that while op-eds and articles could have many ideas, a book should have only one idea. What is the one idea of the power of giving away power?
Oh, Michael, that's tough. That colleague is James Harding, who used to run the BBC, a wonderful contemporary of mine, English guy. It was wise advice. It was hard advice. Okay, let me try this. Okay, I'm cheating here for a second. I am going to give one idea in a moment because it is very much about one idea. But I was listening the other day to a wonderful conversation that you had with Angeles Arian.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so I'm reading this. I'm listening. I'm sort of half watching. This was when you could meet in person. So I'm like half listening, half watching, and she was so wonderful to look at. So I get really excited by this discussion. And so I go online. I was like, well, I'm going to ask Michael to introduce me to her. And then, of course, I learned that she died, I think, within a year or maybe even less after you had that.
I did the last serious conversation with her.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, so then I am going out and buying every book that she wrote. And in the process of buying the book, I discovered this quotation, which had I read it earlier, I would have certainly put it in my book. And here it is. The soul never thinks without an image. And Aristotle, evidently, and I hope it's true that he said it or wrote it. And that was, I think, for her book about shapes. And I love that someone else wrote a book about shapes, because in some ways, the one idea of this book is I set up the contrast between the pyramid mindset, and that is the world of up and down and in and out and ranking and rating and sifting and sorting. It's the world of top down, but as we'll get into later, it's also the world of bottom up, same shape. And that pyramid mindset does provide a kind of stability and a kind of order that can be very oppressive, but it also can be sort of comforting in the sense that order and stability can be comforting. And my book is really about that if we're able to escape the pyramid mindset, which I think has become sort of the default setting, not just out there in the world, but in there within us, that the alternative isn't just chaos and everyone for herself or himself. No, there's another kind of stability and another kind of order. And both these images happen to be on the back of a US dollar bill. So I contrast the pyramid mindset with what I call the constellation mindset, taken from the front of the US seal above the eagle's head, right above where it says e pluribus unum, from many one, is what they called the radiant constellation. Initially 13 asymmetrical stars with beams radiating out behind it. And that image of a constellation is a way we can choose to think of ourselves and those around us. Namely, that you are a star, you are distinctly yourself, you bring your truth, your full self to every encounter, and you look at everyone around you like a star, and you can make connections between people, between stars, if you stick with this, to make something much more useful and more powerful than you ever could alone. And it's a different kind of order and a different kind of stability than the pyramid, and I think much more productive. I think it is at any scale. As a country, it was our best idea. It is the symbol of interdependence. How can you achieve unity without uniformity? How can you get the best of diversity without succumbing to division? That gives us an image to do that with. And I find that image really helpful. And the fact that Aristotle, through Arians, that I learned that phrase is kind of wonderful, because I do think we have these images in our head. And how depressing would it be if we thought that we were supposed to be from many bricks, one pyramid? I mean, that is a way of looking at the world. I find that not a very useful one. And in that world, you either fit in or you're left out. But if you think from many stars, one constellation, and this to me is the most important part, and I'll stop here, in a constellation mindset, you can stand out and fit in at the exact same time. And I think that's what we all need and what we all want.
We will talk about your extraordinary history in just a little bit, but how long would you say it took you in the course of your life to evolve what has become, I would say, a full-fledged philosophy of life and of collaborative work with others?
You know, in the journey that led to this book, I wrote sort of two other books along the way that aren't published. One day they might, but I had to sort of get through all that to get to where I got in this book. And one of those efforts was sort of more of a chronological. I set out never to write a memoir, but it ended up kind of being memoir-y, which was fine and healthy, I think, and helpful, but not really what I don't think that would have helped get this core idea out there. It would have been, it's hard in that to sort of, I don't know, it just felt like it was sort of brags and humble brags and just, I liked elements of it, but I don't think it ended up working as well as I would have liked. So I tried to sort of pinpoint, I can't really pinpoint when that happened. Certainly, I remember when I started writing what turned into this book, I just called it the pyramid and I didn't have another word for it at the time. And I tried pyramid and the snowflake. And I didn't want it to be, Michael, one of those, even though I love these books. Do you know the this and the that books? Anne Marie Slaughter, who's writing and thinking I adore, wrote The Chessboard and the Web and Niall Ferguson wrote The Square and the Tower, the this and the that, the Hedgehog and the Fox, that kind of thing. But those books, which I enjoy, tend to kind of set it up as like an analytical book. And I didn't want it to be just analytical. I wanted it to be slightly more, I don't even know what the right word is, but sort of not just at a distance, not arm's length. Like, no, I think this is something you should live and put into practice. I certainly am trying to. So it was the pyramid and the snowflake for a while. It was the pyramid and the fuzzball, which was just a nonsense image that would have just a placeholder. And snowflake had become kind of a charged image in our political culture. But it is fractal. Maybe we'll get into this. I mean, snowflakes are wonderful, mysterious things. And then I discover the way life works, that I'm looking at a dollar bill and I'm like, what is that thing? It looks kind of like a fuzzball. And it's on the front. If you have a passport and you're American, it's more prominent on a passport. And I've just seen it and looked through it thousands of times. And then I start on Wikipedia, and I love Wikipedia. I read it in the book. I start this, where did this come from? And then I discover the story, that it took longer to design the logo than it did to win the war. So I can't pinpoint the moment. And if I had to, I think it was mostly along the way, seeing how, I don't know, when I learned in science, when we were taught it might be the first law of thermodynamics, the conservation of energy. And that may be true in closed systems and science, but I just knew wherever people are gathered, that is certainly not true. Because I have been witness to, as we all have, and I just sort of maybe am overly sensitive to where energy or power is sort of kindled and created, or whether it is smothered and killed. And this happens all day long. And I am increasingly in my life aware of when it's being smothered and when it's being kindled. Yeah. If that makes sense.
At some point, you showed a draft to Alain de Botton, the remarkable philosopher. And he said to you, how long do you now expect to work on it? I think you said 6 months. And he said something like, it's going to take you 3 years. And he was right almost to the day. But the point is, you already had a draft. How long had you been working on the draft when he told you it would be another 3 years?
Oh, I mean, I was 2 years, almost 2.5, or, I guess 2 years into it, and feeling pretty confident. Right. And I think I even said 3 months. And he was so lovely. And he's like, okay, sure. I mean, by all means, you could get, the Word document in good enough shape. And there are enough pages, and then he added, I don't think I put this in the acknowledgments, but he said, he's looking at the sort of memoir-y version. Yeah. So it really went through, the reason it took 3 more years is it became a totally different book. Mm-hmm. And he's like, I think you should write a book about lost American values. Mm. Now, that is not what my publisher calls this book. It's called the leadership book. And I understand why the team that published it are smarter about book publishing than I am by a lot. But I rebelled. Before we went on, we were talking about these words are so loaded, management. Well, certainly it's not going to be a management book. I mean, that's just a word I won't use. But leadership, it's an important concept. I was like, I don't think that's really what it is. But a book on lost American values, which is a part of what this book is about, is how Alain framed it, which gave me motivation to take it in a new direction. So I'm very grateful to him for that.
After you were born in New York City, like me, you grew up in Lincoln, Massachusetts. You got your degree in history and literature from Harvard in 1993. You joined an internet startup, CNET, which you talked about in the book. And in The Audacity to Win, author and political strategist David Plouffe, how do you say his last name, Plouffe?
It's Plouffe, like the right stuff.
Plouffe, okay. David Plouffe described your grassroots campaign idea of citizen fundraisers as critical to Obama's connection with supporters. But I've read elsewhere that other people really give you considerable credit for helping Obama go win in Iowa, and then against immense odds of Hillary Clinton's well-entrenched candidacy because of the grassroots volunteer and fundraising model, end up raising more than Hillary did, and really transforming a lot about political organizing and fundraising process. Is that fair?
No, well, I mean, it's nice of you. And it was what David says in his book is true, and I think fair. But I'm always quick to point out, I mean, I contributed a small piece of it that I think is important, but it is small. And I think small things are important because small things repeated and repeated can lead to something big and complicated, like a snowflake or broccoli or cities like New York City, or, you know what I mean? So it's that sort of fractal thing, which is kind of geeky, but maybe we'll get into that. So small patterns in tone, if they're healthy ones, repeated and repeated, can lead to something big. So the insight, low dollar fundraising wasn't new, and it wasn't something I contributed. But I think that the insight that I came up with two wonderful women in Louisville, Kentucky, where I'm speaking to you from now, which is my adopted home city, what we did and just proved was that we should treat fundraising like we treat field organizing, which is it would be crazy to wait until the last few months of a presidential campaign to start organizing, introducing yourself to people, trying to find, I mean, no one would do that. You start really early, and it's all about making meaningful human connections with people in small teams and doing that. And so the Obama team, and I talk about a woman named Buffy and a guy named Jeremy and lots who aren't named in the book, but just remarkable people, known and unknown, who did this amazing field organizing work. And that was not my world, but I saw it, and I saw how powerful it was and how much energy was created in that moment. And I said, well, we should just political fundraising can be pretty awful and certainly gets a well-earned bad reputation on both political parties. But I was like, it doesn't need to be that way. I mean, my goodness, 99% of, I was living in Kentucky, don't give to either political campaign back then. I mean, it's a very small slice. Like, why don't we just approach fundraising like field organizing and ask everyone and do it in a systematic way and do it really early and not go ask for $2,000, which 99% of people couldn't afford in their wildest dreams, and just do $20, but build community and relationships in the process of it. And that's the piece that I think I helped contribute to.
Mm-hmm. And then Obama named you ambassador to Sweden after he won. And after that, he asked you to be the finance chair for his re-election campaign, and then asked you to serve as ambassador to the United Kingdom. So there's a lot there, but in the book, you describe how you took these initial insights about sort of constellations and so on, and really broke the mold of how to be an ambassador. In Sweden, took the road show of the embassy out to small cities around Sweden. In England, started going to many schools, talking to the children in schools about what they liked and didn't like about the United States and so forth. So what I see happening, as you describe it in the book, is that these earlier thoughts, first at CNET about how the internet was going to work, then with the Obama campaign about volunteer engagement and fundraising, then in Sweden, taking this roadshow out from the embassy into the countryside and starting a clean energy campaign with Swedes and Americans. And then in the UK with this outreach to young people and transforming how the embassy itself worked in terms of getting people to talk to each other and breaking the mold. So again, I'm trying to encapsulate what I gathered. Am I doing a fair job?
Yes, thank you. Keep going. No, it's lovely to hear it. I mean, you give it in your, in the act of writing a book sort of gives things sort of more coherence in retrospect than they certainly feel in the moment. And your wonderful summing up, as you just did, makes it sort of hold together in a way that I think is true and helpful. It just didn't feel that way at the time. And it's funny, you said break the mold. And I do think that, and it wasn't sort of done in the spirit of iconoclastic breaking. It felt to me like smashing, but it did feel like escaping the pyramid, escaping the energy destroying mindset of, like I talked about earlier, had become the default setting of so many organizations, even ones I was part of. I mean, CNET started off as a .com full of energy from people we never knew, volunteering, product reviews, and all this wonderful stuff. And then we turned into a pyramid. The Obama campaign was unbelievably unleashed magical connections and energy from volunteers, as you talked about. And then the re-election, which I was so proud to be a part of, and I'm so glad we won, was a pyramid. I mean, it was not a joy-producing endeavor. It was meaningful, but it was kind of working backwards from a set destination, and didn't create a lot of new energy. And I think the State Department the role of diplomacy, the State Department at its best is a beautiful constellation. But often we just keep reverting to this pyramid and how we treat ourselves and others. And so wanting to get out of that shape, which in many cases revolves getting out of buildings, because I don't know if Churchill said it or he's attributed, but the whole, like, we shape buildings and then they end up shaping us. There's a wonderful story that didn't make it into the book. And you mentioned I grew up, born in New York, but very much raised outside of Boston. And Arthur Fiedler was a very famous name in Boston and beyond Boston. And I always thought he was the guy who founded the Boston Pops. I mean, there was a Arthur Fiedler Bridge. There were statues of the guy. And then I'm doing a little research when I was over in Sweden. And it turns out, and I should check this, but I mean, he was the 19th head of the Pops. It had been started, stick with me. This is, rough math here. But let's say, they'd had sort of 18 previous leaders in 26 years. They just couldn't keep anyone in the job. But what's really interesting, and I don't know is the Boston Pops, Michael, sort of familiar to people outside of Boston? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, the original idea of the Pops that never worked until Arthur Fiedler took over was this idea of like, hey, we should, we shouldn't just get the sort of upper crust of Boston who pay a lot for a ticket. We should kind of open it up. And this is something that current organizations ever since have struggled with and tried to work through. So they changed the pricing and they'd reorder the tables and they would do all the stuff within Boston Symphony Hall to try to make it more welcoming. And it just never worked. And so Arthur Fiedler, who was something like the third violinist or something, he wasn't sort of the most hierarchically important musician in that world. So he takes over and he's like, you know what? I don't think there's any configuration of chairs in this building that will ever be welcoming. This whole place is intimidating to people, or to 99% of people in Boston. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go out to the banks of the River Charles where people do feel comfortable and are already gathered, and I'm going to go play music for them. Who's with me? And like only 7 people did it. And then 9 people came with him. And then, and I think something like the first violinist it just felt beneath him. Like, I'm just not going to go do that stupid stuff and play that kind of music. Okay, fair enough. He played amazing classical music in the building. But what I love about it, and what I used this story with the team at the embassy in Sweden to say, look, this building is like Boston Symphony Hall. It's off-putting, even though the original architect, Ralph Rapson, built a beautiful building, but we turned it into for understandable reasons, looked like a prison, right? Just huge fences and barbed wire. And so So anyway, Arthur Fiedler, wildly successful. They make Boston Pops records in 1950s, 60s, and it raised something like $52 million, which then went and rebuilt the new Boston Symphony Hall or refurbished it. So it wasn't an either or. It's like, if you are willing to go outside the building, go to where people are, open up, lighten up, it can make the core thing you did stronger. And that relationship. So I love that story. And I tried to get in diplomacy to do a similar thing with this roadshow.
You mentioned the snowflake as an analogy for a kind of growth that you're particularly interested in. How does that work?
Well, and a lot of this comes from Jane Jacobs, who I'm sure whose writing and work you and people listening to this are well aware of. I came to her a little bit late, and I've had so much fun reading her work. And she's most well known for The Death and Life of American Cities, which was her first book, I think 1962, 63. And towards the end of her life, she gave a final interview, or what became the final interview. And she's asked, would you like to be remembered as the person who stood up to Robert Moses to save Greenwich Village? And she said, and I'm paraphrasing, no. Well, that part I'm not paraphrasing. She did say no. And then she said, no, I don't want to. I mean, I had to go stop things because there was so much destruction of things going on in my life. She ended up moving to Toronto and it continued there. But she's like, no, I don't want to be remembered for saying no to things. I want to be remembered for economics and specifically discovering, as she said, the fractal in human economic affairs. And so fractal is that Benoit Mendel brought this idea of, they call it a seed pattern, a simple, small pattern that if you repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, leads to something big and complex. So a snowflake is a fractal. Certain kinds of broccoli, like if you cut a piece of broccoli down from top to bottom and you look at it, it's kind of made up of tiny little broccolis and so on. And the famous first example that Mandelbrot said was like, how long is the coast of England? And, traditional science is like, that is a knowable number. And he's like, no, it's not. It depends what you're measuring with, because from space, it looks like this jagged shape. Then you get much closer, it looks jagged. And then you get right down to the piece of sand on the Cornwall coast. And under a microscope, it is infinitely jagged. It just keeps going. There is no smoothness at any scale. And so it depends. If you have a small enough little thing, you keep measuring it. And so her point, in sort of less esoteric and more real life, when she looked around a place like Greenwich Village, she saw life. Some people saw chaos. Robert Moses called them slums and wanted to clear them and make smooth, clean, in his mind, clean, big housing projects and make everything orderly. So he thought it was orderly. She saw death and disorder where he saw order, and she saw life and a different kind of order in sort of the ballet of the streetscape. And she extended that into all sorts of economic realms. And so I really was inspired. I didn't end up giving her enough space in the book. It just didn't work. She would have to almost be her whole other thing. So I'd love to return to her work in a later book, because she's so remarkable. And her other books aren't as, I think they're very well appreciated for her fans, but they haven't been, I don't think, as appreciated as they should be.
You speak of constellation makers. That is, you have the pyramid, and by contrast, you have the constellation, which, as you point out, your metaphor of the dollar bill, your visual analogy of the dollar bill, that your book, you can get the central point of your book by just looking at the back of the dollar, the front of the dollar, and the pyramid and the constellation. But you mention Jimmy Wales and Dee Hock as two constellation makers. Could you say more about them?
Yeah, and I think, certainly Dee Hock, and it may be different in Northern California. He may be more well known there, but certainly
I know his work, and I know his book. He had a phrase that escapes me right now,
Oh, is it the monkey? Oh, chaotic.
Chaotic, yes.
Yeah, and so I got really into it. So D Hawk, he used to, evidently, I haven't met him. He's still alive, and I've been trying to reach out to him, and I haven't. So if anyone knows him listening here, right, please tell him thank you from me, and that I've been trying to get in touch with him to send him a book and a thank you letter, because his story is so inspiring. And, you know, he used to, when he was kind of on the speaking circuit, he'd hold up a Visa card and he's like, everyone heard of this? All the hands go up. And he's like, and do you know D Hawk? And no one's ever, and he's like, great, that's the way I want it. But he's this really interesting character, born in kind of rural Utah, and ends up getting into the banking world and just really doesn't like it. He doesn't like, and ironically, he's now famous for Visa, which we all has become associated with credit cards, but he didn't like credit. And with debt, and he didn't like debt. He really, but anyway, he was like middle-aged, mid-level manager at a mid-sized bank in a mid-tier city when the story begins. And Bank America has the Bank America card, and it's really not working. Late 60s, early 70s. I mean, it is breaking. The system does not work. And the reason it's not working is you have, and his little mini bank is just part of this big pyramid of which Bank of America sits atop of. They're just affiliates, right? And so it doesn't work. So they get all the affiliate banks together to try to figure out how to fix this thing. And so D, when you're in a meeting and you have an idea and you raise your hand and then all of a sudden you're put in charge, so that happens to D, but he kind of takes it on. And so he has a group of people who also want to fix it. And they give them a few days, lock themselves away in a hotel room in Sausalito, I think it was, to come up with a better plan. And it's too sort of detailed to get into in this setting, but it's certainly told in the book. But he comes up with these principles for in a radically new way of organizing. And in the old way, what happened was all of Bank America itself and all its affiliates were forced into rigid cooperation. Bank of America set the rules and you complied with the rules. Boom, one big pyramid made up of little mini pyramid banks. And then ruthless competition between, let's say, Citibank on the East Coast, so rival big banks and all their affiliates. So there was forced cooperation and then forced competition. And one of Dee's amazing insights was like, he believes in competition and he believes in cooperation, but just creative mixtures of those things. And so he comes up with a whole system where, and this is the big leap, where Bank of America in the new Visa system, it wasn't called Visa at the time, but the technical, how this all works between merchants and lending banks and credit card issuing banks, this whole confusing array, they would all compete and cooperate on absolutely equal terms. So Bank of America would have no more official power or veto power or voting power than his tiny little mid-sized bank. And can you imagine the leap of faith it took on behalf of the leadership at Bank of America? And Dee went in and made his case. And to their credit, they said, okay, we'll take this leap with you. And they did. And it went on to create the largest commercial organization in the history of the world, measured by transactions. It keeps changing every month. So I used to know the figure, $13 trillion of transactions a year or something like that. And so it's a great example, and it is a constellation of individual entities connecting, cooperating, and competing with lots of other ones to reduce the friction of cash. And it's a tricky thing because credit cards now are so rightly associated with really high APRs and all this other stuff, but that was really not. In fact, he got fired from all his earlier banks before he started Visa, what became Visa, because he would advise all his clients not to go into debt, which wasn't exactly the business model of these banks. So he kept on getting fired for doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. And Jimmy Wales, how is Jimmy Wales?
Well, and then Jimmy Wales, probably slightly well-known to some of your listeners than Dee might be, but so he's the guy who co-founded Wikipedia. And what I love about it, now it's a household name, so much so that we often say, let's say we're at the Thanksgiving table and, the dispute arises, a factual dispute arises, and people like get out their phone, and it's like, we'll Google it and put this matter to rest, which is what we do. But we really should say we Wikipedia it, right? Because Google gets you there. It doesn't settle the thing. And usually what pops up first is Wikipedia. And if someone's obscure blog pops up, that doesn't really settle it, right? So Wikipedia is this remarkable thing. But it starts out back in the early 2000s when Harvard Business School had just declared Microsoft the winner in the dictionary in the encyclopedia wars. So Microsoft, then the richest company in the world, takes on one of the oldest companies in the world, Britannica. Who's going to win? And Harvard Business School pronounces Microsoft's Encarta. Some of the listeners may remember Encarta, and it had won, in quotes, for like 6 months. Along comes Jimmy Wales, a commodities trader from Alabama, who says, I am going to make an online encyclopedia. I'm going to pay people $0 to contribute to it, and I'm going to charge people $0 to read it. So can you imagine being in that pitch meeting, right? So people were not very enthusiastic. And which I think most telling, and I know we don't have time for all of this, but he didn't start out. His first idea was not Wikipedia. His first idea was Newpedia, which you've never heard of. None of us has, because it didn't last long. And Newpedia was almost the same as Wikipedia with one crucial difference. And I love this difference because this is the difference between a pyramid and a constellation. Newpedia was, we're going to pay nobody anything. We're not going to charge anything. But because we're the new kids on the block and no one knows us and we're up against the richest company in the world and the oldest company in the world, we are paranoid, and Jimmy was paranoid, that they weren't going to be taken seriously and people were going to plagiarize articles. So they set up a double peer review. I think it was a 10-step process to screen people out. At the end of 1 year, they had only 18 volunteered written articles. So Jimmy gets frustrated. He's like, come on. So he starts to write his own article for it. Come on, this is silly. We need more people. And so he picks a topic, like one of his favorite economists. He writes it. And then he's like, this is so hard, right? I can't even get it through my own 10-step double peer review. And this just wasn't going to work at 18 articles a year. So a colleague of his comes up to him and says, hey, there's a new kind of technology called Wiki. It would let, Michael write a sentence, Jane write a paragraph, Matthew come in, maybe doesn't want to write either, but he's good at editing. So everyone can do what they're good at. And people make articles collaboratively. And Jimmy said, okay, it's worth a shot. And they do it. After the first year, 18,000 articles. And now it's well over, I think, 6 million in English alone. Wikipedia is in 240 countries. It is a beautiful and radiant constellation. It is the largest human knowledge transfer engine the world has ever seen. And it is a beautiful constellation, right? It lets people stand out and make contributions of whatever size and fit into something much greater than they ever could on their own.
So let me reflect with you now some of my experiences with these things. First of all, I've said to you that your approach is very much the approach that we've used at Commonweal for 45 years. Commonweal works in health and healing, education, the arts, and environment and justice, and small organization, but grew from a half dozen projects to 30 or 40 now, and we're certainly not trying to grow. We're responding to requests for service. But one of my basic premise all these years is that the right people show up with a passion for their work who want to work with us. Yeah. And we do a discernment process, and if we agree with them, they join our community. And the deal is really simple. They basically have to find their own resources, and they have immense freedom to do their work. So, my brief version of this is sometimes the idea is mine, sometimes the idea is someone else's, sometimes it comes from the person coming in. But, my version is start something, find people better than you are, and get out of their way. That's, my...
Well, yes. And can I just pick up on that last phrase? Because this is a question I've been getting sort of on this book tour virtual book tour that I'm on. And I get the question, I think, for good reason, because it's called The Power of Giving Away Power, How the Best Leaders Learn to Let Go. And there's a perception, I think, and that it's sort of like delegating or power sharing or something, which I know are close, but I think it's important, certainly from where I see it. The publisher wouldn't let me say the power of giving away power so that you get it back again, so that you can give it away again, so that you can get it back again, which is sort of a mouthful. And yet what I just said actually describes, and I'm curious if you agree in your Commonweal experience over the decades, that that's actually what happens. You don't give it away in this sort of selfless way. Like you give it away because you know you don't have all the right answers, and then you get it back, and then you give it away again, and it's sort of mysterious mutuality that gives the whole thing energy, and it comes back again. And so even the word delegating kind of has that sort of hands off.
I agree with you, and but here's the other side for me, because I was walking with a colleague up here on Whidbey Island, where we also lived part of the time, from a wonderful nonprofit up here. And she had just taken it over, and she was in love with Dee Hock's chaotic system of organizing. And she was going to run the nonprofit on that model. And I basically said to her, I wish you luck. Because I said that in my experience, that part of the process of decentralized decision-making is that at a place like Commonweal but in many organizations, is that if it isn't clear who the final decision maker is, there is the perception of a vacuum of how things will ultimately be decided, which creates power struggles, basically. And my colleague, Oren Schlossberg, and so at Commonweal, while I was running it, now Oren, I've always wanted it to be clear that somebody had the final say, that someone had the final say. And to me, that is what has enabled us. And Oren said to me in the, 7 years he'd been working with me, he said he'd never seen me exercise that power, which was...
It's so interesting, Michael. Yeah. Jimmy Wales said something almost exactly what you said. I think he described it to our embassy team when he was asked along a similar line. And he said, I'm kind of like a constitutional monarch. I have these powers, and if I were to use them, I would probably lose them.
Right.
But that they exist in, and I thought that was clever. And I'm still trying to think through this stuff. That someone we haven't talked about who's hugely important to me is Mary Parker Follett.
Yes, I was going to ask about
who I wish were here, but she died 100 years ago. So Mary Parker Follett is this amazing woman who wrote 100 years ago she's American, grew up outside of Boston, did all her social work in Boston, born 1868, dies 1933. At her time, she was the most sought after speaker on what she had sort of like the viral TED Talk of her day. And it was all about, Michael, what you're talking about and what I'm talking about. And it's really interesting, I think, particularly for all of us now, because she's writing about in America coming out of a global pandemic, big raging debates about minimum wage, about the power of big business, about the fear of government overregulation, all these things, social, economic, racial division everywhere she looks. And those can all sound big and daunting, but she had this belief that we could start to heal in really small groups. And so her killer TED Talk, so to speak, was, I shouldn't say killer, her wonderful TED Talk was, she's the one who came up with power with, not power over. And she called it the law of the situation. And her first speech was called On Giving Orders. And And so she, I think, would say, if she were part of this conversation, she would say, if you set it up right, the what she meant by law of the situation, if everyone's clear about what is trying to be accomplished, that thing that is outside of everyone and bigger than everyone, it will sort of be the decision maker on what happens. Right, at most of the time.
And for me, the way I talk about that is I start a project and people have different tolerances for ambiguity. I have a really high tolerance for ambiguity. So I start a project, and because people need some sense of vision, I'm not talking about all projects at Common, I'm talking about the ones that I start.
Yeah.
I start it and I lay out a vision so that people say, oh, okay, that's what the plan is. But the other part is I am totally unattached to whether my vision turns out to be what happens or not.
Yes.
And what I talk about is I'm waiting for the universe to show us what this project wants to be. So there's the combination of personal detachment from whether the vision I've laid out is how it turns out to be, and a complete openness to whether somebody else has a better idea or whether the universe, as we do this, start small, make your mistakes early, embrace error, and let the universe show you what the project wants to be. So that's one point. I want to go to one other and then ask you to respond. It seems to me that as you said, that Mary Parker Follett was Peter Drucker's guru, and he was the 20th century's most influential management thinker, leadership thinker. And you said her ideas boil down to 3 expectations: expect to need others, expect to be needed, and expect to be changed. And I think that's really beautiful, you know.
Well, I almost said that, and thank you, because when you asked me at the outset of our conversation, hey, if a book can only be about one idea, what's that one idea? And as I scrambled to come up with an answer, that was one thing I almost said, like bring those 3 expectations to every encounter. And because what's brilliant about her insight, I think, and I'm glad you picked up on that, is that if you put it in sort of today's lingo, I mean, that is today's lingo because I wrote those. I mean, she doesn't say it that way, but that's where she's pointing. So expect to be needed, we would say bring your full self, right? Nobody else can. So if you don't bring your full self, you are denying that group something that only you can provide. Okay. Number 2, expect to need others, right? So this is her point. Like, you just can't come in and expect to have your idea win. Like, why did you invite anyone else to the meeting, right? And then the third expectation is the most important because, and this kind of gets back to the only reason she thinks you should ever get together, you know, not to win, not to let someone else win, and not even to compromise, which is hard because we're often told by society to compromise. She's like, compromising is just winning and losing in little miniature bits. The only reason you should get together is co-creation. Make something together. You might make a determination together. You might make a house together. I mean, it could be physical or small, or make a whiteboard sketch together. Really doesn't matter. The act of making something. Together. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally. More on that later. But it was your point about, like, once you set that in motion, that thing you've made is totally and forever part of you. You are forever part of it, but you're not diminished in it. You start to see the Constellation thing happening. Like, you're still your distinct person, but you're just part of this new combination. And so, yes, bring your full self, but you have a reciprocal obligation to leave that meeting a different person than you came in. And that is a hard and really, I think, important third point, because then we're always growing and we don't get stuck and become a, one note Charlie, one note Charlotte.
So this is the point at which I really love this conversation, because we get into real conversation here. I think of all the different situations in which constellation work happens in very different ways. So, for example, the anarchist movement in Spain before Franco, you could certainly say was a constellation movement. It was radically decentralized. Nobody was in control, but it wasn't chaotic. It was just a remarkable experiment. Paul Hawkins, you may know, wrote this extraordinary book called Blessed Unrest. And it was about essentially the global movement to save the world. And he said, it's the greatest social movement anybody's ever seen. And yet sociologists of social movements can't understand it because it doesn't seem to have a leader anywhere. He said it's like an immune system of the body, that wherever there's trouble, the needed cells gather to knit things up. And he said that these local organizations cannot afford to be fanatics of the left or the right or whatever, because they're trying to solve a local situation and they need as many people as possible involved. So with both anarchism and the Blessed Unrest model, you have a true constellation without single leadership. And you have, in effect, in the anarchism model, you have something similar to the Mary Parker Follett, what are the rules of the road for this particular situation? In the Blessed Unrest model, you don't even have any rules. But coming back to my friend who ran the organization here, as I kept checking back in with her over time, because she really believed that this organization could run without her being in control. I said to her, I'll be just really interested to see how that works out for you. And over time, she did realize, at least this is my interpretation, that it was important for her to have the final say, because otherwise people, and I would suggest to you that in most of the situations where you have made this work, that there are people who have the final say, that in the Obama campaign, at CNET, in the embassies and so on and so forth, you were letting this loose, you were unleashing it, but in each situation, somebody had the final say. And I'm not sure, and please.
Well, I mean, so yeah, I know what you mean. And you, I mean, certainly a case of CNET in the campaign, there is someone in a, so the part I think these words are important. It's like final say and control, I think, are understandable words to get at what you're talking about, which is so a word I prefer, just because I think it's less. There is in all these constellations a rigor, right? So let's take Wikipedia for a second. We talked about Jimmy as constitutional monarch, so I think he would sort of agree with that premise you made. What's really remarkable is there's a rigor from the outset, right from the beginning. I mean, it is a miracle 20 years later that Wikipedia isn't a giant corkboard for humanity, right? Of just self-promotion and self-trashing. I mean, look, it has its issues, right? I mean, of highly contentious pages that people are kind of fighting out our culture wars on Wikipedia, but that is a tiny fraction of what's happening. What it's a self-correcting and self-healing thing, but a very rigorous sense of what encyclopedia article, the pattern and tone of that article. You can't be it's not MySpace, it's not Facebook, it's not look at me, and that was always part of their vision. And same with Visa. I mean, real rigor. And I talk a little bit, and I should, many listeners, and I think you and your team know a lot more about AA, but I am inspired by its history and its present, and how most people have heard of the 12 steps. I had never heard of the 12 principles.
And you also speak of the 12 traditions.
Yeah. So the 12 principles are how a group should function as a group and how groups deal with other groups. Yeah. And as I went back and read this history, that how important that was, so that it didn't devolve into sort of chaotic, self-promoting, And so the rigor around group dynamics within a group and between groups, it's almost mirroring how D. Hawk set it up with Visa. And so I go back to that word rigor and, competition and cooperation at the same time, and real clear rules and purpose, all that stuff. It's not some sort of amorphous group hug, which often I'm sure Commonweal is accused of, this book will be accused of. No, there's lots of rigor there, which is the point you're making to your friend. And control is the word you use, which, you need someone. Okay, so here's a question I have for you.
Did I use the word control? I
yes, you did. No, okay. You said control, which is, and that just comes with the whole.
Oh, I said somebody's in control.
Yeah, someone's in control, and so you're not controlled. But, and I'm not saying you're wrong. It is something I'm thinking through. Okay, so my mom has helped me be aware of the wonderful healing circle work.
That's a perfect example of what we're talking about in a lot.
So here's a question I've had for you and so I understand that there are two, I think someone plays, and I'm capitalizing these in my head, and they may not be official roles, but I loved when I heard about them. Mm-hmm. Someone plays capital H host. Is that true? And then someone plays, to me, capital G, sort of guardian, maybe? Okay. Mm-hmm. So I love those words because I haven't done a healing circle, but so I get that. And my question to you, I think so many good things in life come in fours, right? 4 gospels, Harry Potter, 4 houses. So 4, 4, 4. 3s too, but let's just stick with 4s. So I imagine a room where host is written in one corner and it has a few descriptions of what's required of a host. Mm-hmm. I imagine in another corner, guardian, and a brief description of what's required of a guardian. I think, not knowing group dynamics as well as you do, but being fascinated by it, that there are 2 other corners. And now I'm going beyond healing circle. I'm just saying wherever people are gathered. And the name would be that everyone in a thing could find their main corner. And they may be torn between 2, but they're like, yeah, this is my corner. Now, I contrast this with like a jury pool, right? You get together with a jury pool. I've never been in one. I never get picked. Don't know why that is. But it's like you can be the jury 4 person or just a juror, right? And so much of that's just the pyramid. Like who's going to be the quarterback or the boss? Because someone's got to be. Maybe you have and so I'm wondering what the other 2 corners would be that would give a home to people who don't want to be host and don't want to be guardian. Have you putting you on the spot here?
This is such a great conversation. And let me bring in something else that you talk about that is relevant to the conversation. But first, Alcoholics Anonymous is my go-to example of one of the great social inventions of the 20th century. I mean, it's completely extraordinary. And there are other similar social movements. I mean, the self-care movement in the United States is an extraordinary movement without the structure of AA. The scouting movement is often overlooked as an extraordinary movement, which has a fascinating history. So these social movements, I mean, then you get into the civil rights movement, the human rights movement, the women's movement. So at what point, I'm not asking you to answer this, but we're reflecting together, at what point are movements which I think have that constellation quality with no one in control, and yet because there isn't a rigor to guide them, they tend to break up into different, factions or whatever.
Yeah.
The places that hold, and maybe we're really getting somewhere here, are the ones that have a rigor and a very clear sense of purpose. And I would agree with you that, they needed founders. Religions are examples of that, although they tend to break up. But they need founders. They need a moral code, which is a certain rigor. But what
Go ahead. Well, no, I just was, if you go back to Jane Jacobs and you go back to this idea of a fractal seed pattern, that first little pattern. And as I learned about AA, and you have, that it's a stockbroker in Akron, Ohio, who helps heal a doctor.
Right.
I just love that, the stockbroker healing a doctor. But the call that the stockbroker makes when he arrives on a business trip and starts to feel himself sinking into this hole, he calls a priest. It's like, do you know any alcoholics? And the priest is like, no, which is interesting because he probably did. But he's like, but I know a woman who does. And there's a woman who I'm sure must be famous. I hope she is in AA circles, Henrietta. So the priest connects the stockbroker to Henrietta. Henrietta says, I have just the person. I have been trying unsuccessfully to help Dr. Bob for so long. And the reason the stockbroker needs a fellow addict is he's like, I can only help myself through and by helping somebody else. So built into that very first pattern, and Henrietta gets them together, is a basic need for somebody else, not because he's being selfish and not because he's being selfless. His liberation is inexorably tied up with somebody else's. And so you need to add one. And that's a great guard from the beginning against being a little clique and being contented with how perfect you are, which in so many other organizations may start well, but then start to calcify and be proud of who they're keeping out.
One of the places in the book that really struck me, and again, the book is catalyzing my thinking about our work moving forward in so many ways. But you report this massive study that Google did about what makes the most effective leadership team. And what did they find?
Yeah, so that, is it the most, the one with the most charismatic leader? Is it the one with the most hands-off leader? Is it the one with the most diversity? Is it the one with the most homogeneity? You name it. They looked at every possible thing, multi-year study through lots of smart people and resources at this question. And number one, and Professor Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School is amazing. And I just was able to speak and I learned a lot from her about this. And Charles Duhigg writes about it. Number one thing is, do these teams have with and through one another psychological safety? Is the buzzword, and a good buzzword, I think. But can they get real with one another? Is this, which is kind of wonderful, that is and in my book, I sort of come at it from this idea of fruitful friction. And that we shouldn't be scared of difference and we shouldn't be scared of friction as long as we can make it constructive. And it's where I think where the work you care so much about and I care so much about can be mischaracterized as sort of naive and feel good and good news. It's like, no. This is embracing difference and struggle and making it productive. And that's what I think the Google project, which was called Project Aristotle. We started off our discussion quoting Aristotle with, the soul never thinks without an image. The soul never thinks without an image. And so what is the image we have of ourselves and of those around us?
Yeah, when in your discussion of psychological safety, you described that the qualities of it, my words, are strong relationships. People aren't blamed for their mistakes. I would say we embrace error. It's okay to bring up the hard stuff. It's okay to ask for assistance. And Churchill's line about charity toward each other's shortcomings. Yeah.
Go ahead. Well, and Churchill, who's someone who is sort of, I guess controversial these days or talked about, but he's certainly the image so many have of him as an imperfect and really important leader. And certainly living in London, he's just always, and I had to weirdly get in all these sort of stupid things because there was this rumor that Obama had like banished the Churchill bust from the White House. It wasn't true. He had one his entire presidency sitting right outside his private office in the residence. But the story wouldn't die. So I had to find myself doing like, wasn't really what I wanted to talk about. And then I just thought about that image of like a Churchill bust, like a head, like a disembodied head cast in bronze all by itself. And I was like, what a ludicrous, here is this imperfect and really important man who, and right down the street from where I live, or where we worked at the American Embassy, was this, I think, the right image to have of him, which is him on a park bench, smoking a cigar, and then, cast in bronze for sure. But, and then FDR next to him with space in between for someone to go sit down. And I was like, that's a better, because he coined special relationship, which has become a cliche that people either love or hate, but no thinking going on. And so I tried to sort of unpack, what do we mean special relationship? What's the opposite of special? Routine. What's the opposite of relationship, which is about people? Let's call it transactions. So the opposite of a special relationship is a routine transaction. And boy, aided and abetted by technology, we have all gotten really good at creating routine transactions. But the cost of having a friction-free experience is there's no energy there. That's the catch in the cost, right? So that's where the Google stuff ties in, which is if you can create psychological safety, then you can form these special, like real special, lowercase s r, special relationships where the fruitful friction lives. So,
and you have a 2x2 grid that you used in the UK could you say more about how that grid?
I know it's so tricky in a podcast format because I'm a visual thinker and so many of these things. And I tried not to have too many in the book, but I hope I got the balance right. But it is one of those 2x2, northwest, east, south, that takes the word special sort of over to the east and the opposite routine to the west and relationship to the north and transaction to the south. And it talks about special relationships in the upper right-hand corner, routine transactions in the lower left-hand corner, fruitful friction and friction-free, and that most healthy group dynamics can flow between those two in what I call a Bloom loop. And it gets a little esoteric, but I'll tell me if this works for you. I try to do it in a family setting, and I'll start with the friction-free. I remember on the way to school every day in Lincoln, Massachusetts, I'd go by our neighbor's house and we'd stop and pick up their youngest daughter, who was my older sister's best friend. It was the Perry's house, wonderful family. So I got to see somebody else's breakfast every single morning growing up, which is kind of a weird thing. You normally don't see that. And I loved it because it was sort of mysterious. I mean, it was like burnt coffee. I remember that. Burnt coffee and toast was the smell, which I loved for some reason, and I'd go in and I'd watch them, and and this is, I think, true of so many families with small kids. There's almost no talking that happens. There's like this silent ballet where no one's talking, just sort of grunting little micro movements. They all know the role they have to play to get through the breakfast. It doesn't last very long. And then I thought to myself, it's like, and I read in an article, and I can't remember who wrote it, but they talked about the difference between the ballet of breakfast and the drama of dinner. And that it's family dinners where laughter happens and tears happen and people get up and stomp out of the room or hug each other, right? So that is fruitful friction. So if we go back to our 2x2, the drama of family dinner is in the upper right-hand corner, and the sort of friction-free ballet of breakfast is in the lower left. And they relate, like you earn the right to be friction-free because you spend time in both quadrants and you get this kind of Bloom loopy thing going. And that's in contrast, and I'm not sure this is going to hold up here on audio, but that's in contrast to those other quadrants, which we didn't talk about, which is routine relationships. When you get off an airplane back when we could fly more, and the nice flight attendant says, "Thanks for coming. Thanks for flying with us. Thanks for flying with us. Thanks for flying." I mean, they say the exact same thing to 80 people in a row. And you just sort of think, gosh, why don't you just make a recording? Like clearly you don't mean this. Why don't you just automate that? Or when you go to the doctor's office, which is the special transaction corner, and you fill out the identical paperwork you filled out 10 times before. And you just think, aren't I already in the system? Again, replicate it, automate it. So our tendency is to push everything down and to the left into a friction-free space. And what I think Churchill and these leaders are like, and you have to go invest and empathize and humanize and spend time in that psychological safety, fruitful friction quadrant. And then you get that happy bloom loop, as I call it.
I want to go a little bit into your life story a little more. Let me just take two people, Jacques Barzun, who was the French-American historian, known for his studies of history of ideas and cultural history. And then Lucretia Coffin-Mott, who is an ancestor of yours, a feminist activist and a strong advocate for ending slavery. Now, you've been trained in history, and your book is highly historically informed. Do you think much about Lucretia Mott and Jacques Barzun and sort of how those lineages have come down to you, what they mean to you?
I do. It's loaded for me. My grandfather Barzun is sort of in his own category in my mind, just because he was he was alive. He died at 104 and 11/12 in 2012. So I was how old? 42. So I've known him he died when I was 42. And he was an unbelievable mentor and grandfather to me. He wasn't sort of bounce you on your knee kind of grandfather. He wasn't like that. It was sort of, and I sort of went out of my way to try to develop a relationship with them. I sort of worked at it. And I would send him all the papers I wrote in high school after the fact. I'd already gotten the grade on them, right? But then he would send them back, and he had this amazingly, I think the Lycée in Paris taught him beautiful handwriting. And so he would send it back. Redlined line edits on all the paper. It's like, I've already written it. I wasn't asking for help. I just was sort of, I guess, showing off in my teenage way. But he was tough. Lovingly tough about writing. And so one of the most impactful things actually happened towards the end of towards the end of his life. My little brother Charles, or my younger brother Charles, and I would go see him and his wonderful wife Marguerite, who is my step grandmother. They had moved down to San Antonio from New York, and he revealed to me that he had really wanted to be, after he left Columbia, a diplomat. And at the time, I was a diplomat serving in Sweden at the time. And I thought, oh, that's so nice, because I had sort of wanted to go into his line of work and be a professor, and it didn't turn out that way. And then it was neat for him to say, oh, I wanted to be a diplomat, but it didn't turn out that way. So that was kind of fun. But for Lucretia Mott, who is a wonderful story and inspiring, my great times 5 grandmother, who, as you said, was born on Nantucket, Massachusetts, to a Quaker family, then spent her adult life outside of Philadelphia, and was an amazing social activist and an amazing mother and an amazing grandmother. Really started her public career at age 40. And she started out, and she was actually she was very clear in her own mind that women could wait, basically. I don't know if she put it that way, but the first order of business was to end the horrors of slavery. And then we could try to expand suffrage to women. But she was very clear and made some of the younger generation. She was a mentor to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She chaired the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. but I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. But before that, she was pretty adamant about it. And then I think the story goes, she goes to London to speak at an abolition conference, and she isn't allowed up on, she was a great speaker, wasn't allowed up on stage because she was a woman. And that just was like, oh, okay, wait, these things aren't, you can rationally disconnect the two, but these all connect. And these, and then of course, dedicated the rest of her life to both. And so that's inspiring, but it's funny, I grew up in Boston with wonderful parents and grandparents and all that stuff, but there is the ancestor worship part of, which exists anywhere. Boston does it pretty well. And by well, that's not really a compliment. Like, it is not so great. I got into a funny debate. So my great times 10 grandfather was this guy, John Winthrop, who was the first governor of Massachusetts back in 1630. And so there's a fair amount of sort of ancestor worship for him. And he came from this little town in Suffolk. So when I was in London, I went there. And that was a neat connection or whatever. But I did the math, and I won't remember it off the top of my head. But I said, okay, so he's 10 generations or 11 generations, right? My great times 10 grandfather. I have, what is the math? We could do it. I think I have 5,094 if you did a reverse family tree. 5,094 great, and I picked him, right? And if you flip it, so that's just an upside down pyramid, right? All those other people and then me at the bottom. So I don't like to look at the world that way. If you do the other kind, like how many people could claim him as his 10 times? Now that's less precise math because you don't know, but I mean, it's on the order of 500,000. Right? So it's not so precious. And yet we treat it. And if you happen to have the same name, fine, you're telling yourself a story. But I think we go overboard with that stuff. So
sure we do. I guess.
And here's a fun one. So I find out through my wonderful mother. So we grew up in this little town where like the Revolutionary War started, right? So like we thought Patriots Day, which for those of you listening is April 19th, like I thought that was a national holiday. It was like almost like Christmas. Mm-hmm. Everyone would dress up like redcoats or like Minutemen. We'd march to Concord. I mean, it was huge. So I found out like 2 years ago that our great times 5 grandfather is Paul Revere. Like, that is kind of cool. No one ever mentioned that, which is just so weird. The stories we choose to pass on about who sort of matters in the past. And so I like this idea of adopting historical figures who you have no, quote, blood relation to, but who are just your long lost, mentors from another age, and you learn from them through books and then pass them on. So that to me is where I choose to focus.
Do you have any religious, spiritual, or philosophical guiding star that you're able to describe?
Ooh. In an earlier version of the book, I describe, and it got taken out because the book changed so dramatically and it wouldn't make sense. But so I'm an adult convert Christian, which I remember saying that to my siblings. And they're like, well, that's slightly misleading. So I'll explain it. My mother is very spiritual and I don't know how you can ask her herself. I would say Episcopalian, but religious the way. But my dad is not. And I want to make sure if he's listening that I don't categorize him, but definitely not religious, somewhere on the agnostic to atheist part of the spectrum. So when my parents got divorced, I was 11. And my mother, so I'm one of 4 children. So I have an older sister, younger brother. And we lived right next to the little church in Lincoln, Mass, like 200 yards from this little white New Englandy church, which tells you something. It was half, let me see if I get this right, half Congregationalist, half Unitarian, and they would rotate. So now that I know a little bit more about Christianity, half the time your minister would believe in the divinity of Christ and half the time they wouldn't, which is kind of a big deal, I think, in retrospect. But anyway, it was that somehow worked for them in the decliningly religious part of, Boston. So anyway, at age 11, my mom says, well, my dad moved out And my mom says, well, it's up to you. Your dad didn't want you to be baptized, but now you can be baptized. And so my sister says yes, and my little sister says yes, and my little brother says yes, and I fold my arms, and I was like, nope, don't believe in any of this stuff. And I mean, I was just sort of a rebellious, pissed off 11-year-old, but it felt really good to be given the choice and to be able to say no. Then I went to an Episcopal boarding school, and I refused to ever sing a hymn, ever say amen. I mean, I was really, again, just sort of rebellious and like, I don't believe any of this stuff. And I would, so, and I think sort of the culture, I tried to describe this later to my kids, that the culture, and I don't attribute this to my parents, but just sort of the culture I grew up in broadly was like, oh, come on, smart people don't believe in God. Like, really. So anyway, long story short, I marry an amazing woman named Brooke, and she's Catholic. And I think, oh my gosh, I have to get married in a church. Like, I'm not going to stand up and say things I don't believe. So it just became this whole journey. So I started reading, and I read G.K. Chesterton, which led me to Dorothy Sayers, which led me to C.S. Lewis. And it really all started up here. And then it started to kind of go down here, pointing to from my head to my heart. I started reading. And long story short, when we had our third child named Charles, when he got baptized, I decided to get baptized. So I was age 30. I guess I just turned 35. And it was tricky because we went to a Catholic church, but I wasn't ready to be baptized Catholic. I just wanted to be Christian like I would have been at age 11. But it turns out if you're a grown-up, you can't get baptized. You got to do the whole thing. So I ended up doing outside the cathedral. And then you have to have like a home church, but I did have a home church, but they wouldn't do it. So it became really convoluted. So we had this team effort that I got one amazing man who agreed to have my baptism certificate stay at his house church. This amazing woman from Indiana came down, and she did the actual baptism. And our now deceased archbishop from the Catholic Church, he was told like there were rules for these things. He could be a witness to it, but he had to be over 28 feet away. And so he marched 28 feet away, and there he was. And he was so wonderfully supportive. So anyway, that is a long story I don't think I've ever said out loud before.
I'm very grateful. And having been baptized, what does it mean to you?
Well, then I had this dream. The part that I took out of the book was a few years before, but I know it connects to, so maybe 4 years before I get baptized, I wake up, it wasn't the middle of the night. It was like 6 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of these things, I'm sure you've had this. I've talked to other people. Like I say a waking dream, which is sort of how you think about it. But I'm thinking, and it's a boxing match, which I've never been to in real life. But Muhammad Ali at this time is alive. He lives in Louisville. I have no connection to Muhammad Ali at all, but I had just moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where he's from. And I have this incredibly vivid dream that he is boxing. And I am like 20 rows back watching him box. And he gets knocked out and he doesn't get up. And for some reason, I, with no connection to Muhammad Ali in this dream, run down into the ring, and he like put his head in my lap, and I'm like there, and he's dying in my arms. And I am like absolutely overwhelmed with like just love, like filling me up like a vessel, just like overflowing. And I sit up in bed, and I'm like tears all the way to, like crying like I've never cried before. And I was looking around. I was like, my wife is sleeping, and I was like, that is strange and beautiful. And so I turned around. I kept a little dream journal back then. So I just I write it all down. Yeah. So I haven't said that before, but I did write it down for this earlier book that I kind of put on the shelf. So that was a big moment of like, wow, okay, that feeling of overwhelming love and joy and connectedness was a sort of a big dream, as they say.
And since you rejected religion for a really long time. Was there any kind of philosophical or pragmatic philosophical? Was there a way of being in the world that was a guidance system for you?
Yeah, well, Dorothy Sayers is this. I don't know if you've read any of her work. I mean, she supported herself writing these wonderful Peter Wimsey detective novels, which are great. But she wrote this book, and my grandfather recommended it to me, and it's a short book. In fact, I was aiming to make my book, it's nowhere near as good, but I wanted to make it roughly the length of Mind of the Maker, which she wrote, 1943. And she says, and I really encourage everyone to read it. It is so good, and I'm not going to do her justice in this recap. But she basically says, look, there's two images we're given of God the Father and God the Creator. She said, God the Father is tricky for me. I didn't have a very good one, and I'm never going to be one. Right? And I thought that was so beautiful. She was like, I'm a woman, so I can't be a dad. And so she's like, fine, other people can write about God the Father. I don't find that helpful. But I think, she said, I think we all can relate to making things. And she's like, I make books, you might make tables or chairs or whatever, but like we make things as people. And then the whole rest of the book, and she's like, look, I'm not trying to turn you into a Christian. This is not one of those things. She says, okay, there is the idea of the book. And it occurs in a flash, like it's done. Like I know what it is. And so she's kind of calls that in the Christian sense, she's like, that's like God the Father, the idea. And then she says, now you have to make it manifest. You actually have to put literal pen to paper back in her day and write it out. Okay, so you do that. And then she's like, so let me actually stay away from the Christian stuff because her point's actually really relevant to people who aren't Christian in anything. It's just a statement about creativity. She's like, the idea of the thing, then you got to go make the thing. So write the book, 185 pages. Then, and this is the really interesting part. So there's the book as idea, the book as written, and then the third thing and the final thing is the book as read. And she's like, now you can make the distinction about the idea of the book, the actual physical manifestation of the book, and the reading of the book. They are all the book. And she's like, and they're mysteriously all interconnected. You can understand the difference, but you can't really ever separate them. And so in the Christian Trinity one, it's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, 3 in 1. And she's like, she likes to reflect on the sort of mystically on, wow, how something can be at once 3 different things, but really just one thing.
That's beautiful.
It really stuck with me. And at that point, when I started reading her, I wasn't far on my spiritual journey as much, but it really just struck me as someone who was making websites. I was like, oh, that's kind of neat. Just the creative process as idea, do it, experience it. And in diplomacy, it was relevant because we started off the conversation. Like I went to 200 high schools, as you mentioned. I did workshops with 20,000 British 18-year-old girls and boys and asked them about their fears and frustrations and their hopes. And it was really, each one was different and remarkably the same, but lovely. And I was asked to come give a talk to the guy who ran the Department of Education for the whole United Kingdom, wonderful man, and asked me to share what I'd learned from all these British students. So I did. And I remember, and then I opened it up for questions. And I remember you can just tell someone's body language, right? There was this guy who was sitting in the front row during my speech, and he just hated it. He didn't know who I was, but his arms were folded and he didn't hold up 2 thumbs down, but his facial expression basically said that. And of course, he asked the first question. So I was like, all right, this isn't going to be fun. So I was like, yes, sir. What do you think? And he said, well, yeah, fine. What does any of that have to do with policy? Which I guess presumably he thought was my job. And it was one of those moments, like, I don't remember what I said, but it was something sort of defensive and apologetic, just some bad blend of defensive and apologetic. And then I moved on to the next question, and that was more positive and whatever. And then I think the French call it spirit of the staircase. When it occurs to you long after you're gone, the thing you wish you'd said. And it occurred to me, and it was Dorothy Sayers. And then ever after, I sort of brought her to the forefront of my mind, which was, and he's just like, this, none of this counts in his world. Like talking to young people, like, it's like filler. Like real decisions get made in, small rooms of people at Whitehall or whatever. And what I wish I had said was, and I wish I had drawn for him Dorothy Sayers' mind of the maker diagram. And I was like, there is the idea of a policy. Like, what if we did blank? Think about this in the context of like the effort, which will be fascinating and critical, to get the whole globe vaccinated against COVID in the next year and a half. The idea of the policy, the actually making it manifest, rolling it out, as we say in government speak. And then there is the policy as experienced by the people getting it, living in it, whatever that might be. And so I wished I had said to this man who really didn't like what I was saying, well, sir, I think listening is policy. But it's that third component of listening to as experienced by the people it was made with, through, and for, if you're in either of our two democracies. Hmm. So that's how I kind of take Dorothy Sayers into the secular realm.
Toward the end of your ambassadorship in the UK, you resigned after Donald Trump was elected. But toward the end, you attended a very, what's the right word, highfalutin dinner. And had
thank you for making me tell this, Michael.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And by the way, there's, I do feel like there is one thing that Donald Trump has been accused of that is not fair. Mm-hmm. And I just going to take this moment to say it.
Yeah.
That the tradition going back decades, Republican and Democrat, every political appointee like me is, regardless of political party, is asked to and expected, and they know it going in, to resign when the new person takes over. And there were a bunch of news stories out there that he cleaned everyone out. Now, he may have done lots of other things to career Foreign Service people. I'm not excusing that. But in the case of me, I knew exactly the day I would leave, if the other political party won, and that was true. So I just want to set that straight. Okay, so it was this wonderful dinner with the official wonderful people, leaders from government, military, cultural leaders, and my wife Brooke and I were invited to come. And I had spent the day doing one of these workshops up in Scotland with young people, and then I jetted down. I had to put on black tie, go to this dinner. Couldn't have been more gracious. And then throughout what I'm about to say. So then at the beginning of the meal, we all sit down and I am asked by the host to give a tour of the horizon, which is sort of a diplomatic lingo for give the update on what America is up to in the world. Right. And this is the sort of thing that ambassadors are expected to do at dinners like this. And I had done it many, 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 many times before. And my wife's sitting across the table from me and she looks at me and she mouths, "Are you okay?" But her expression is like, "You don't look okay." And she was right. Like, I just felt terrible. And so I try to loosen my bow tie, which is a hard thing to do. And I'm like, I don't feel well. And so I was like, "Excuse me, sir, just 1 second." So I kind of get up and I walk behind this long, long, long row of formal chairs to just try to go get some air. And there's like a little short stairway down to where I think I can get to the restroom. But at the top of the little staircase, I pass out and projectile vomit everywhere. And I don't know in what order that happened, but it doesn't really matter. And I wake up and my head is in the lap of Simon, the wonderful security guard. And I should be mortified or whatever, but I found myself just strangely at peace. And it's more, and the hosts are incredibly gracious, and I get whisked off and my wife is worried, but I was like, this is not a problem. I am not sick. It's not food poisoning. We hadn't even really eaten yet. It wasn't something scary and medical. I was allergic to that tone of voice I was about to take, which is the often wrong, never in doubt tone of voice, and just pretending basically that I knew. I was about to talk about the civil war in Syria and about, the transatlantic trade deal. This is all stuff that I, quote, knew about. I mean, this is what we did. So I knew enough, but it's just pretending. It's like pretending America has all the answers, pretending that I, representing America, have all the answers, and that I'm going to give you a lecture about the way the world is now from our vantage point. And it just struck me as like the pyramid, which is this mindset that I can fake, but I don't like faking. And I just resolved after that embarrassing moment, I'm just not going to do that again. And it brings me to a question I was hoping, if I can, to ask you, which is a little weird. And I'll tell you why in a second I'm asking. And you're not the first person I've asked, and there's no right or wrong answer. But it's, how do you visualize time, Michael? And I'm going to ask you to use your hands, which I will try to describe to listeners. So like, if I say, this coming September, we're talking at the end of June. When I say this September, Michael, where is September visually if you used your hands? Is it sort of out in front of you, to the right? Where is September, or a year from now, June?
Let me reflect for a moment. I'm going to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
At 77, if you haven't figured this out before, I think you have to be prepared to die at any moment.
Mm.
And so September for me, I know it will be there for the world. I hope it will be there for me. Mm-hmm. I love life. I hope for many more years of service. But September is an unknown. Mm. And so I can use my hands, although my tremor becomes obvious when I use them.
Okay.
But so I don't mind using them. But I would say, what I would say? I would say September is like this.
Ooh, okay. So arms expanded.
It's neither past nor present. It is the movement of the great mystery. There is no, classic. Past is behind us. Future is unknown. Only the present is real. And it is a continuously moving present through which we move.
Wow. So okay. That is very beautiful. And I wish everyone could see what I am seeing with your beautiful outstretched hands over your head. And the reason I ask, and I know we're running out of time, but what I would start to do at these dinner parties where I didn't want to go give a fake pretending lecture about American foreign policy is I would ask everyone to go counterclockwise and share how they visualize time. And which is a weird question. Like no one's used to answering it, which is why I like it. So no one has a set thing that they're going to say that they've said a million times before. And I've asked 1,000 people this question. And what's interesting, without kidding, I remember my lovely wife, Brooke, at first was like, darling, that is really stupid. And I said, oh, thank you. Why do you think it's so stupid? And she's like, because everyone pictures time exactly the same way. And I smiled. I was like, oh, this is going to be fun. Well, darling, how do you visualize time? And she put her hand straight out in front of her in a straight line. She said, life is a highway going directly away from me. And every month, you asked about September, every month is just an exit sign on the highway. So this September is 3 exits away. And the September after that is, I can't see it, but it's 15 exits away. And I was like, okay, fascinating. I don't look at time like that. I look at time weirdly like a hockey rink that goes counterclockwise in a circle forever, which is weird. Strangely, my little brother has the exact same image. And no one ever teaches you this, I don't think, right? So let's say I've asked 1,000 people. I've heard like, some people it goes up and down, it goes left to right, it goes like a clock. I mean, for my mom, it's a clock with, December is 12 and January is 1 o'clock, and it kind of makes some kind of sense. My point being, an amazing guy, Teddy Abrams, who's head of our orchestra. I asked him, and he's like, no one's ever asked me. I was like, no, I know, that's why I'm asking you. And he said, time is like a slinky. And he's much younger than I am. And he says, do you know what a slinky is? I was like, yeah, I do. He's like, time's like a slinky. Sometimes in life, I'm just going around and not getting anywhere. Sometimes the slinky is stretched. So I'm doing a circle, but I'm corkscrewing and I'm going somewhere. And I was like, oh, that's cool. I wish I looked at time like that. But my point, Michael, was we carry these ending where we started with Aristotle and Angeles Ariane and her conversation with you 8 years ago. The soul never thinks without an image. And if that's true, what is the images that we all have in our minds about ourselves and those around us? And too often, I think it's this pyramid thing. And what if we could think about ourselves as stars and everyone else around us as stars? I think that could really help.
How beautiful. Well, Matthew Barzun, I am so grateful to spend this time with you.
This was so much fun, Michael.
I have to confess that I hope it's not our last conversation.
Oh, I know. Well, you make sure you make it till September. Come on. And beyond. Yeah. And I will make the same, not that we are in control of these things, but to the extent we are, I would love to keep this conversation going because...
Wonderful. So, Matthew, you are the author of a book that really has moved me and that I will give to people. It's called The Power of Giving Away Power by Matthew Barzun, How the Best Leaders Learn to Let Go. And it really has, in some very deep ways, catalyzed my own thinking about how I hope to work over the next few years. As I've said to you, I find it's so resonant with the way I think and work, but you've expanded my horizon of what that means and how to hold that. So I'm personally grateful.
Thank you. I want to close with a tiny thing. I don't know if it'll make it into the broadcast, but I hope it does, because when I first met you 25 years ago, my grandmother Winthrop, that you mentioned at the outset, Eleanor, she said to me right before my mom, Sarita, drove us up to Bolinas, and she said, now, Matthew, do you understand you're about to go meet a genius? And I said, because this is MacArthur, it had all happened. And I said, oh, that's cool. Yeah, great. And I did know that. And then I met you, and your warm welcome and your humility and, of course, tons of wisdom and all that kind of accomplishment. And I thought, this is so cool. And I just remember that. I was like, I had preconceived ideas because of all this stuff on paper that you had achieved and all my grandmother had told you. And you were just this wonderful, as you are today, open, curious, seeking, beautiful person. And that was so inspiring to my 25-year-old self. So I want to thank you for being that then and being that every single day.
And what a joy to meet again in this way. So
until next time.
Blessed till next time.